In mid-January of 1945, World War II was approaching its decisive moments. The Allies were putting the Nazis on the ropes. At this point, the role of the Soviet Union's military forces, known as the Red Army, was crucial. Among those men, none stood out as much as Colonel Anatoly Shapiro. He had trained as an engineering technician, but in 1935 he chose to serve his homeland. He became one of the main enemies of the Wehrmacht, Hitler's armed forces, because of his leadership on the battlefield and his Jewish religion. At that time, Shapiro was called to a meeting with Major General Peter Subok of the division in the 322nd 1st Ukrainian Front. The order was clear and direct. He had to prepare the 1085th Tarnopol Rifle Regiment to liberate the Auschwitz concentration camp. Shapiro and his 900 men knew it wouldn't be easy. As soon as they approached the outskirts of that Polish city, the German soldiers strengthened their defenses. It was clear that he intended to buy time to destroy every piece of evidence of his crimes, but the colonel and his soldiers did not give in. They fought against every threat and navigated minefields. When January 27th arrived, Shapiro had lost half of his army, but he had succeeded. In front of them was the infamous concentration camp they had heard so much about. By this point, the military leader had experienced the wide variety of horrors that only a war can offer. However, when he prepared to cross the gates of that infamous detention center, he would discover a new level of horror. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. How was it possible that what happened in Auschwitz took place without the world reacting in time? Why was this specific location chosen? What happened to the prisoners who were too weak to be released? To dive into this epic tale of ferocity, dehumanization, and hope, we must travel to January 27, 1945, the day the liberation of Ashwood took place. If you're interested in this kind of content, I invite you to write World War in the comments. There are more than 200 people writing World War. We're going to make another video related to this topic, otherwise we'll move on to something else. Let's get started. Long before it became known for the concentration camp, Auschwitz was a Polish city called Oswiecim. The first record of its existence dates back to 1117. It was part of Austrian lands and later belonged to the Kingdom of Bohemia and Prussia. After the First World War, it came under the control of Poland, which had now become an independent country. More than half of the inhabitants of Oswiecim were Jewish. The community grew steadily due to immigration and knew how to coexist with the German citizens. On the other hand, the conditions of the place had become optimal thanks to the railway station, which was established in 1900. The economy was thriving. The population of 14,000 inhabitants found a good environment to live in peacefully. But everything changed in 1939 when World War II broke out. A year later, Poland was occupied by the Nazis. The military advanced on the capital, Warsaw, and cities like Krakow, but they focused especially on Oswiecim. They considered it a key geographical point in the east. The railway lines from the south of Prague and Vienna crossed with those from Berlin, Warsaw, and industrial areas north of Silesia. That way, it would be possible for them to organize mass transports of prisoners. In September of that year, Oswiecim was occupied by the Wehrmacht, and at the same time, it was annexed to the Reich. The plans for what was now called Auschwitz were announced on April 27, 1940. They would build the largest and most ambitious concentration camp ever planned by the Nazis. The construction of the complex was supervised by the Gestapo, known by the initials SS, the paramilitary police and penitentiary organization serving Hitler. They would also be responsible for fulfilling the three objectives defined for every concentration camp: to imprison those considered enemies of the Nazi regime and the German occupation authorities in Poland, to provide forced labor for the SS construction companies, and to serve as a place to execute a select group of people who were considered a supposed threat to German interests. However, those rules would be taken to unimaginable levels. Although it is usually considered a single concentration camp, Auschwitz was divided into three specific zones as well as other subcamps. The main sector was Auschwitz I. There, the operations base for the entire complex was established. It was built in April 1940 in some barracks that the Polish army had set up on the outskirts of the city. During the early periods, WWII was the destination for prisoners brought from the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in Germany. They were mostly common criminals. However, 728 Polish political prisoners were also transferred. Soon after, the German forces imprisoned prisoners of war, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and anyone who was labeled as an antisocial element. But from 1942 onwards, the majority of the prisoners became Jewish. Since coming to power in 1933, Hitler was determined to carry out a racial cleansing. Thus, the Hebrew people became the target of hatred. In addition, they were blamed for supporting the soldiers who in 1941 thwarted Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Faced with this situation, the High Command of the Nazi Party, the SS, set in motion an extermination plan known as the Final Solution. Plain and simple, the Holocaust had begun. The deportations were coordinated by the SS officer Adolf Eichmann, who would become one of the visible faces of Nazism. The prisoners of Auschwitz I were forced to work on construction projects, including the expansion of the complex where they were held captive. They also had to work the fields. Later, they were used in the nearest weapons factory. The workers had to be supervised by the prisoner capos selected by the SS. In each case, the officers intimidated them with marching music played by an orchestra. Equally disturbing was the inscription that stood out at the entrance, Arbeit macht frei, which can be translated as work makes you free. Attempts to escape were in vain. The surroundings were patrolled by guards who did not hesitate to shoot at any attempt to flee. The conditions of the prisoners could not have been more humiliating. The isolation was harmful, and their efforts to encourage each other were not enough. Poor nutrition and lack of hygiene led to malnutrition and diseases. Many prisoners began to die under the unflinching gaze of the officers, but death was not exclusive to the weakest. The SS never lost sight of the annihilating purpose of the camp. They proceeded to execute and hang those they wanted out of the way, until they resorted to even more terrible methods that also went down in history. In 1941, they installed a gas chamber. First, they selected 600 Soviet prisoners of war and another 250 sick prisoners to be exposed to Cyclone B, a cyanide-based pesticide. They also installed a crematory oven to incinerate the bodies. This mechanism of human destruction at Ashwood had a reference point, Commander Rudolf Höss. The man had been appointed chief of the concentration camp and soon made his efficiency clear. He had the vision to expand the place and also the coldness to take human lives. By 1942, Ashwood had 20,000 prisoners and a status that commanded respect in the Nazi Party. There was no doubt that it had become a scene of pure horror, but nothing compared to Ashwood II. The second concentration camp that Ashwood occupied was Ashwood II-Birkenau, and it was the one that would become the most infamous. This began to be built in 1941, in a village 3 kilometers from Ashwood called Sesinka, which the Germans called Birkenau. The SS intended it to be even bigger than Ashwood Afars, so it covered 2.5 kilometers by 2 kilometers. This prison was divided into 10 sections, separated by barbed wire and electrified fences. Sections were organized for men, women, Roma families, deportees from Germany and other countries, and above all, Jewish families. Unlike Ashwood II, where prisoners were forced to work, Ashwood II-Birkenau was dedicated to extermination. Would it be the most decisive initiative to carry out the final solution? 4 gas chambers were built with their corresponding crematoria, and inside each one there was space for 2,500 prisoners per shift. Elderly people, children, the sick, no one was safe from a tragic fate. To deceive them, the officers told them that these were showers where they could bathe. Many of these prisoners were Jews who had been captured in the European countries occupied by the Germans. They arrived directly by train after days locked in boxcars without food or water. Those who were in better health were sent to Ashwood first for forced labor. The extermination was brutal and merciless, but there was an even more gruesome ordeal for the prisoners: medical experiments. The officers specifically selected women to be used in fertility tests. Here, the authority was Dr. Joseph Mengele, who was behind the most atrocious experiments. One of his priorities was experimenting on twins in order to create the perfect soldiers for the Third Reich. No less sinister were his procedures to change people's eye color so they would have Aryan blue eyes. If the test subjects did not recover or were too weak, they were given a lethal injection of phenol. The horrors perpetrated in Ashwood II at Birkenau tainted the air the prisoners breathed. Anyone could be next, and some tried to rebel. On October 7, 1944, hundreds of prisoners assigned to Crematorium 4 rose up against the officers, killing 3 of them. Using explosives they had smuggled in, Jewish women blew up that crematorium and the adjacent gas chamber. But the Germans had more armed men and soon put down the revolt. Most of the rebels were killed instantly. The smugglers were executed by hanging. In January 1945, Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II proved to be real slaughterhouses, but the satellite locations were not far behind. Of Auschwitz subcamps, the most notorious was Auschwitz III. Monowitz, since its creation in May 1942, housed prisoners who had to work in the Buna synthetic rubber factory near the village of Monowitz. The company belonged to the German conglomerate Interessengemeinschaft Farben, which had invested millions in that camp. Since Ashwood I was mainly intended for prisoners as labor, however, the medical staff of Ashwood II Birkenau used to carry out medical examinations. Those who were too sick or too weak to keep working were sent to the gas chambers. Even though it doesn't have the same dark reputation as Ashwood I and Auschwitz II Birkenau, Auschwitz II Monowitz still retains its infamy. But the days of that concentration camp and of Nazism were numbered by the end of 1944. World War II was coming to an end, and the Germans knew that defeat was imminent. The Red Army was advancing through Eastern Europe, so they were cornering them. In July of that year, they had arrived at the Magdaner concentration camp, where they found gas chambers that evidenced the Nazis' cruelties. Faced with this situation, the SS decided to close the concentration camps located outside Germany, especially Auschwitz. First, they dismantled Auschwitz II Birkenau so that what happened in Majdanek would not happen again. But the priority was different: to evacuate the prisoners and transfer them to concentration camps within German territory, such as Sachsenhausen and Dachau. If they were rescued by the Allies, would they reveal more details about the Third Reich? In that atmosphere of urgency, the SS officers forced more than 60,000 prisoners to march, 55 kilometers toward the city of Gliwice or toward Wenceslaus in Upper Silesia, where they would be put on trains bound for Germany. They had to cross unstable terrain regardless of the harsh weather, walking with shoes full of holes or even barefoot. They suffered from hunger, thirst, and cold, but they could not stop. Falling behind meant being shot on the spot by German soldiers, who were not spared from the harsh conditions either. It was an episode that the prisoners themselves called the death marches, but that evacuation turned out to be another fatal fate for the prisoners. It is estimated that 3,000 people died just on the way to Gliwice. Although the SS tried to evacuate all of Ashwood, there were still 7,000 prisoners left, too weak and sick to face an exodus. At first they were watched by a few guards, but when those guards abandoned the facilities, they were able to wander around the camp. That way they found some food and shelter. However, some of them dropped dead. The corpses were left in the same place, partly because the open pit was overflowing with bodies, and partly because the others didn't have the strength to carry them and dig a new grave. The conditions of these abandoned prisoners were alarming until the 1085th Tarnopol Rifle Regiment commanded by Shapiro appeared. And that's how our story returns to the beginning. January 27th, 1945. Almost at 3 in the afternoon, Shapiro and his men arrived at the Ashwood concentration camp complex. The gates were locked with padlocks, but a few machine gun shots were enough to break them and get inside. It was snowing, but the colonel smelled something burning. Soon he noticed a stench that he found overwhelming, a smell that seemed like a mix of filth, feces, decay, and above all, death. Just a few steps into the complex, Shapiro came across entities that only had shreds of humanity left. They were like zombies wandering in the cold, without coats or any emotion on their faces. The colonel told them, "We are the Soviet army, you are freed from German rule." Only at that moment did some of those survivors notice the soldiers and approach them, both confused and grateful. Some reached out their arms to touch the red stars on their uniforms. Others mumbled in different languages, according to where they were from, which increased the sense of confusion. Shapiro couldn't believe it. He had already come across concentration camps before, but he always found them empty. They could only imagine the barbarity committed inside, but now the horror was right in front of them, a scene that, as a Jew, hit him even harder. In search of more survivors, Shapiro and his men continued their journey. With every step, An atrocity unfolded that surpassed everything he had experienced throughout World War II. Bodies protruding from the snow, pools of frozen blood. No less terrible was the walk through the gas chambers, the crematoriums, and the so-called hospital where Mengele and his team carried out their experiments. When he passed by a barrack meant for children, there were only a few of them. They were so terrified that they shouted, "We are not Jews," even though they actually were. When they saw them, the uniformed men thought they were other German soldiers. Disturbed by the catalogue of horrors but maintaining his composure, Shapiro authorized the Red Cross to enter and care for the prisoners, preparing chicken and vegetable soup for them. Attempts to provide them with more abundant meals proved fatal for some. Their stomachs were not prepared after months of starvation, and many died. Outraged, the members of Tarnopol wanted to kill all the Germans. Shapiro had to calm them down. He explained to them that many of them were not Nazis and had not committed crimes in the name of Hitler. But deep down he was also outraged. He was aware that the help they were providing was not enough, so he asked for reinforcements. In addition, he knew it would be necessary to widely publicize those brutal acts. The world needed to know about Auschwitz and learn about the humanitarian catastrophe. The liberation of Auschwitz became a symbol of the end of World War II. But it also confirmed that the atrocities committed by the Nazis had reached unimaginable proportions. No one could have imagined that the Nazis had designed such an atrocious mechanism to dehumanize and annihilate. The magnitude of the monstrosities committed at that place in Poland was backed up by numbers. The Soviet soldiers found 370,000 men's suits, 837,000 women's dresses, 44,000 pairs of shoes, and 7.7 tons of human hair, which in total corresponded to approximately 140,000 people. On the other hand, it is estimated that between 1940 and 1945, the SS and the German police sent at least 1.3 million people to Auschwitz. Of that number, 1.1 million were exterminated. Focusing on the Jewish population, it is estimated that 1,095,000 were deported, of which 960,000 died. More general figures showed that during World War II, more than 6 million Jews were annihilated in various concentration camps. At the end of 1945, the images of Auschwitz were fundamental in the Nuremberg trials, the first international trial for war crimes in the history of humanity. And in all the trials against Nazi figures over the decades, justice also reached the main people involved in Auschwitz, like the commander Rudolf Höss. After being tried by the Supreme National Tribunal of Poland, he was hanged on April 16, 1947, next to the crematorium of Auschwitz II. The case of Eichmann was different. He was found by the Mossad in Argentina, where he was living under another identity. Mengele also hid in South America, but managed to avoid being caught. He died in 1979 in Brazil, although his remains were only identified in 1985. Ashby's repercussions were important and decisive, but what happened to the colonel who led the liberation? After Ashby's liberation, Shapiro became one of the symbols of victory against the Nazi regime and the end of World War II. In the Soviet Union, he was received as a hero. The Red Army gave him every possible honor, and his fellow countrymen never stopped expressing their admiration. But he never lost his focus. His testimony about the events of January 27, 1945, still today, gives us an idea of that nightmare orchestrated by Nazism in Poland. He never stopped talking about the subject and even expressed his deep wish for the following generations not to allow for even a second that what happened during those years is ever repeated again. Despite the honors and congratulations, Shapiro's life after the war was not peaceful. He worked in a military factory, but he always felt that he was discriminated against for being Jewish. In 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, he emigrated with his family to Long Island, United States. There, he gained a broader understanding of how much his people had suffered at the hands of Hitler's forces. That's why he decided to write autobiographical books where he tells about his experiences on the battlefield. Anatoly Shapiro died on October 8, 2005. A year later, the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yushchenko, awarded him the posthumous title of National Hero. During all this time, the soldier who liberated Ashwood and revealed a dark reality never lost relevance. More than 80 years later, the liberation of Ashwood remains relevant through various initiatives. In 1946, the Soviet Union handed over the concentration camp complex to the state of Poland. A year later, the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum was inaugurated, dedicated to the memory of the victims. This initiative was supported by some of the former prisoners who took care of preserving the building structure and the objects, so that visitors can become aware of what happened there. In 1979, Auschwitz-Birkenau became a United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization World Heritage Site. Additionally, January 27th became an important date. Since 2006. Thanks to the United Nations General Assembly, the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust is celebrated. The purpose continues to be dissemination and education without forgetting the fight against racism, anti-Semitism, and intolerance. United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization and other organizations are still concerned because the Holocaust continues to be remembered and researched. The horrors of Ashwood inspired countless works of art, from books and songs to documentaries and movies. One of the most recent is Son of Interest. There you find the intimacy of Hoss, who lived an idyllic existence with his family. Meanwhile, behind a wall, the prisoners were living through a nightmare. The liberation of Ashwood will always be a cause for celebration and a synonym for justice. However, the mere mention of its name speaks to the violence of human beings in the name of an ideology. Between 1933 and 1945, the SS of Nazism took control of the camp system and directed it against an ever-growing list of enemies. For that reason, this was not the only camp where atrocities, both human and historical, took place. There are many more places to which a full report could be dedicated. These are hells that, judging by the wars that still happen in the world, seem unwilling to disappear completely.